As we head into December, we're going to start hearing more about the war on Christmas. But before the focus shifts in that direction, it's worth noticing the much more direct and intense war being waged on the holiday that we just celebrated, which is Thanksgiving. The war on Thanksgiving has been raging for years now as the cultural powers that be attempt to turn a time of gratitude and celebration into an occasion for guilt and recrimination. Now, we know that these forces seek to destroy all traditions passed to us by our ancestors, and this is the primary issue that they have with Christmas, too, with every holiday that they themselves didn't invent, is that it's a tradition passed to us by our ancestors, and so they hate it reflexively. But Thanksgiving, like Columbus Day, is especially egregious in their eyes because it harkens back to the European conquest of North America, which is an historical event that these days is supposed to provoke nothing but grief and lamentation. In fact, for years, the left has tried to literally rebrand Thanksgiving as un-Thanksgiving, or as it's called in some quarters now, Thanksgiving is a national day of mourning, in recognition, of course, of alleged atrocities carried out against indigenous people by white settlers. This was the message that the left tried to send again this past Thanksgiving, many taking the opportunity to post on social media with messages like this. This is from journalist Walter Brahman, who says, "While giving thanks and celebrating the holiday, remember it is a national day of mourning for Native Americans that marks generations of broken promises and oppression. It is important to recognize that legacy as we grapple with a resurgent fascist movement, solidarity forever." And then he continues, "Say it with me. The United States carried out a genocide against this continent's indigenous people, and it served as a blueprint for future generations." A writer named Simon Moya Smith agreed, posting, "Today is the National Day of Mourning for indigenous peoples all across this land. We also call it un-Thanksgiving. On this day, we as natives celebrate our resiliency and that we are still here. The U.S. tried to kill every indigenous man, woman, and child, but we are still here." And there were also acts of protests around the country, like in Chicago, as New York Post reports, quote, "For the second time in under 2 months, a statue dedicated to former President Abraham Lincoln was defaced in Chicago on Thanksgiving. A statue of a young Abraham Lincoln in Sen Park in Chicago's Edgewater neighborhood was found covered in splotches of red paint, along with the words colonizer and land back." According to the Chicago Tribune, the statue also had Dakota 38 written on it in reference to the Dakota Sioux members who Lincoln ordered to be executed following the Dakota War of 1862. Well, it's a good thing that there aren't any injustices happening in the world today, right now, which frees us up to protest injustices from 150 years ago. That is quite a nice luxury, I must say. But, maybe even something to be thankful for. I don't know. Just not on Thanksgiving, as the holiday is simply too complicated now. It's complicated. This indeed has become the media's favorite term to describe Thanksgiving, with many outlets bringing in Native American activists to talk about the emotional complexities surrounding what we all once thought was a simple and wholesome holiday, but it's not anymore because it's just complicated. Watch.
Thanksgiving originally celebrated a harvest feast shared by Native Americans and English colonists. But as Fox 43's Harry Lee explains, the holiday can bring out different emotions for indigenous people.
For many Americans, Thanksgiving means gathering with family to eat a large meal together. For Native Americans, the holiday isn't so simple.
A lot of people in the indigenous communities do want to look at this as a time of mourning because they see, just what we have lost.
After Europeans colonized North America, many Native communities were decimated by disease, famine, and displacement. Frank Littlebear of the Plains Cree Nation explains, though, that the many tribes and families of indigenous communities now celebrate Thanksgiving in different ways. He points out fall was always a season of thanks.
It actually started in October, a time of, receiving the harvest of like the Three Sisters, the corn, bean, squash, deer, things like that, and really preparing for winter. So it was actually a time of celebration.
As for the elementary school depictions of the first Thanksgiving, which often depict Puritan English and Wampanoag tribe members inaccurately dressed in Western Plains attire,
I think, there's certain things that they could probably do better.
Littlebear says it's still important to build a connection to Native American culture from a young age.
It's a building process that's not going to happen overnight.
Build a connection to Native American culture. That's what Thanksgiving's about. Meanwhile, the ACLU tried the repetition technique, posting on Thanksgiving morning in all caps, "You are on native land. You 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 are on native land." Unfortunately, they only repeated the phrase 10 times. If they could have squeezed in that 11th time, I may have been convinced, but they only got to 10. Now, there are a few points here that I think are worth making. First, of course, the story about Thanksgiving that we tell our children, or used to tell them, is simplified, okay? That's because young children are only capable of understanding simple concepts. You give them the simple version first, and then over time, you build on it, adding layers of complexity. And in fact, the left agrees with this, which is why they haven't actually set out to give children a more complex or nuanced understanding of the European settlement of the New World. Instead, they've replaced one simplified story with a different, but even more simplified story. It's just been simplified in the other direction. So the popular and simplified myth now, told not just to children, but hammered into everybody's head, is a story of evil, barbaric white people who came here and just immediately carried out a genocide against peaceful Indians, who never did a single thing to deserve or provoke any of the violence visited upon them. This is the story we're supposed to believe now. It is the new founding myth of America. You know, every nation has its founding myth, right? Usually the myths are designed to instill pride and patriotism and gratitude. And yes, they're not always 100% accurate. But people in other cultures and in other countries, they don't spend time debunking, well, that's not exactly how it happened. They wouldn't have been dressed like that. That's not the point of the story. Okay, getting the wardrobe details right isn't the point. A lot of times the point is, again, to instill pride, patriotism, and gratitude. But our new founding myth is designed instead to instill resentment and guilt and shame. The modern Western world is the only civilization in history that I'm aware of that lies to itself about its own history and founding in order to make itself seem worse. Second, as I've pointed out many times in the past and will continue to point out, the claim that we stole land from Native Americans, from some group called, quote, Native Americans or, quote, indigenous people is incoherent. There never was any homogenous group of natives occupying this land before the settlers got here. Okay, it's not like the whole country was occupied by this one group that we would call Native Americans. There were rather disparate and warring tribes that waged wars of conquest and extermination against each other and had been doing so for centuries before we arrived. The ACLU says that we're on native land, but whose land exactly? I mean, which natives? The ones who were most recently occupying the land when white people showed up, or the ones who those natives stole it from? Or the natives who it was stolen from, or the natives who had it before that, etc. I mean, you have to be more specific. But you can't be more specific because there is no coherent chain of custody for this allegedly stolen land. There was, for thousands of years rather, only the law of conquest, which is a law that all people lived by and died by. That doesn't make it right, doesn't make it wrong, it just makes it what it is, what it was. It simply means that it doesn't make any sense to try and identify special victims of conquest, because every conquered people were conquerors before they were conquered. So there are winners and losers in such a system. This is the distinction. You want to talk about the left wants nuance? Well, here it is. In a world governed by the law of conquest, which is how the whole world was governed for thousands of years, there are winners and losers, but it is much harder to identify villains and victims. You know, by the law of the land at the time, it's hard to make villains out of Indian tribes that, for example, massacred settlements. That's just how it worked. And the settlements were on land that those Indian tribes wanted or felt that they had a right to. But it's also hard to make villains out of the settlers who responded in kind to that sort of aggression. Again, it's the way the world worked. We can only be grateful that we do not live in times nearly as harsh or unforgiving as that. And we can and should be grateful to our ancestors who gave us the comfortable and luxurious lives that we lead. Modern people love to feast at the banquet of Western civilization while still whining about the people who provided the banquet and judging them for doing what they had to do in order to provide it. But you notice that none of these people are leaving the banquet. They're still shoving their fat, ungrateful faces. Third, and this is the point that I most wanted to drive home, and it is this. I am a Native American, okay? I am a Native American, and so are most of you in the audience. And I don't mean that in the Elizabeth Warren sense. I'm not claiming 1/1000th Comanche blood or whatever. I'm saying that I was born here, I am a citizen, and therefore I am a native. I am a native to this country, and I am an American, therefore I am a Native American. Now, that's a title that we really need to start using correctly. Any legal citizen born in this country is native to it, and thus is a Native American. We have no trouble recognizing this when it comes to state citizenship. Now, if I told you that I was a native Marylander because I was born in Maryland, nobody would have any problem with that. I am native to Maryland because I was born there. And yet somehow we have this idea that I can be native to Maryland, again, something no one would dispute, a native Marylander, and yet not native to the country that Maryland is a part of. So I can say I'm a native Marylander, but I cannot say I'm a Native American, because that title, native to the country, is reserved for a very specific group of people, to a special victim group, because they were here originally, we're told. But they weren't. Because if you trace it back far enough, every person who has ever lived on this side of the world is originally from the other side of it. Nobody is native here in the absolute sense. We are all descended from foreign nomads, all of us. And yet, my ancestors came here, just as the ancestors of those we call indigenous came here. And my ancestors fought for this land and conquered it, just as the so-called indigenous people had done before them. And then I was born, and this is my country. It is my home. It is my native land. And I'm proud of that. And I apologize to no one for it. That'll do it for this portion of the show. As we move over to the members block, hope to see you there. If not, talk to you tomorrow. Godspeed.